Hey everyone, this is Pastor James, and this is 607 Entire Sanctification. I want to try to help explain what entire sanctification is. I have met a lot of people that don't understand what entire sanctification is, and if you don't understand it, and if you can't explain it, then you're really missing an experience that God has for you. This is one of our articles of faith, or one of the values that we value the most. It's Article 10, and I would encourage you after this video to go find a manual and read it. Um, Entire sanctification at its core is really about holiness. Holiness is something that we set aside. It's something that is the opposite of common. Um, Holiness is not us not doing bad things. Our holiness is not, um, we're a Christian and now we don't do bad things anymore. Holiness is God giving us His holiness. It says we have the righteousness of God. We don't have our righteousness, we have His righteousness. Holiness is really, it's not about our behavior. It's about receiving part of God's character. And it's about being able to handle a gift that God has given us, and being able to handle it well. And that affects our behavior. The more that we're able to understand this and steward this gift, appropriately care for this gift, our holiness that God's given us, the more that we'll understand God, the more that we will be able to interact with God, and the more we'll receive more of God's character. I'm convinced that God gives us as much of His character as we can handle. And the more that we understand this gift of holiness, of righteousness, the more that we will begin to know God, and not just know about Him, but to know Him and be with Him. Um, Another word for holiness is sanctification. And I'm going to take just a few moments and explain to you four different types of sanctification that we believe in, right? So remember, sanctification, holiness, same thing. Um, Initial sanctification is that salvation moment. It's that moment where you prayed, God, I believe in you, forgive me my sins, and come into my life. On the timeline of your Christian walk, this would be at the very, very beginning. And then we have something called final sanctification, or death. It's when we die. And that's when we die, God finishes the work that He started in us. That's when we are no longer in the process of being saved. We are saved, and we enter into heaven, and we receive all that God has for us. And the Bible says that while we're alive, it's like we're seeing things through like a dimly lit mirror. It's hard to see. As much as we're trying, and as much as God helps us, it's we can only see part. But when we're finally sanctified, right? When we get to the end and we receive that final sanctification, and God finishes the work in us, and He gives us this new heavenly body for our new creation to live in, then we see this finally like aha moment, and the flesh is gone, and we're brought into a place where we have no more tears, no more pain, and we have this complete understanding. So we're going to focus on the place in between salvation and death. Um, in between salvation and death is something called progressive sanctification, or what we would call holy life. This is the day in and day out, everyday thing that God calls us to, that He helps us through our entire life. It's these moment after moment after moment where God says, you really don't need to have this a part of your life. I want to set you free from this. It's a journey and a process that God leads us on. Philippians 1:4 says this about our progressive sanctification. Be confident of this, that He who began a good work will carry it on to completion until the day of Christ Jesus. We see three different sanctification types in this verse. He who began a good work, that's the initial sanctification where we get saved. That's where Jesus calls us to say yes to him, and we choose to say yes to him and invite him into our life. I don't know if you knew that, but you didn't just choose to say yes to Jesus on your own. He called you, he chose you, and he helped you to believe in him. And then it says he began it, and he began this good work, and he will carry it on. There is this progressive day in and day out where God helps us over and over and over again in this journey of faith, this pilgrim's progress of helping us become a better Christ follower. And he will bring it to completion, final sanctification, with that day when we finally die and we go home to be with Christ. So we have this progressive sanctification, this thing that happens every day of our lives. I want to share this verse with you too. 2 Corinthians 3:18, and we all who with unveiled faces contemplate the Lord's glory are being transformed into his image with ever increasing glory, which comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. We are being transformed to be like Jesus. It's this journey, this process that happens, and it's ever increasing. It's more and more. The more that we say yes, the more that God leads us and helps us and guides us and gives us more of his character, more of his holiness, more of his righteousness, more of his love and joy and peace and patience and kindness and goodness, the more that he helps us be self-controlled. This is this journey, this progressive sanctification that we have. Now, there is this fourth type of sanctification, and this is the one that we're talking about, that we're going to try to explain, and it is entire sanctification. This is a moment where God calls you and says, I want you to be entirely sanctified or entirely devoted or entirely committed. I want you to be all in. I don't want you to mess around with sin anymore. Sometimes in our Christian life, we can get saved, but we can still have kind of like one foot in with sin and then this other foot in with God. We can be two-faced Christians sometimes, where we go to church and we're one way, but then when we go to school or work, we're another way. And there's this moment where God calls us and says, it's time for you to be entirely or completely all in with me, sanctified by me and for me. Now, entire sanctification is like initial sanctification and final sanctification, in that those weren't really a process. It was a specific moment. Whereas progressive sanctification is a process, it is a journey, it is a moment. And actually, when I hear people talk about entire sanctification, I hear so often they confuse it with progressive sanctification. And they talk about, well, it's this journey that we're on, that God helps us and it never ends. And that's great. That's completely right. But that's not entire sanctification. It's progressive sanctification. So I want to help us understand entire sanctification better. Um, Romans 13 talks about that moment where it says, the night is nearly over, the day is almost here. So put aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. As Paul encouraging the Romans, you've been, you know, one foot in with the world and one foot in with Christ. It's time to put both feet in with Jesus. Stop messing around with darkness and start being 100% in on the armor of light. So, one of the ways that you can tell if you've been entirely sanctified is by looking at what type of things that you struggle with and the temptations that you deal with. Usually, this is not 100%. It's not like, this is all true. But before you're entirely sanctified, a lot of times what you're going to be struggling with in your temptations are going to be sins of the flesh, or obvious things like lying, cheating, stealing, lust, pornography, gossip, those kind of things. The sins of the spirit that happen after entire sanctification are usually more attached with our character. I wasn't as patient. I wasn't as kind. I wasn't as gentle. I'm not spending enough time with Jesus. I have too much pride in my life. I'm not humble. I need to be a better leader, a better father. So there's this difference. But again, it's not like uh, you get tempted with lust and you think, oh, maybe I'm not entirely sanctified. That's not how that works. It's just one of the indicators where you can look at. Because when you say, I'm done, Jesus, I want to be all in with you, he actually comes and does this work of grace in our lives that helps us um, and frees us up from our flesh. And it's not that our flesh isn't there anymore, and it's not that we're not tempted by it anymore, but he sets it free from us, and he gives us this power to be able to say, I have already put that in my past. Jesus has already forgave that, and I am pushing ahead, following Jesus 100%. That stuff is now dead to me, and God helps you live that promise. Um, Entire sanctification is this moment that God calls us to, like I mentioned, and then we have to respond. It's not just like you wake up one day and God downloads this new upgrade to your life. That's not it. He calls you to it. You have to hear it. You have to respond to it. And you have to be willing to work at it and say yes to it. And it is a specific moment, like I mentioned. Um, my theology professor from Northwest Nazarene University, Dr. Leclerc, gave this brilliant analogy of sanctification, whether it's initial or entire sanctification, that it often happens like physical death. So let me explain that. She said that when you physically die, sometimes it's dramatic. You walk outside and you get hit by a bus, and you could tell, that person died on that day, at that time, at that second. And then there's another kind of physical death where it's really gradual and it happens in the middle of the night. And eventually a person stops breathing and their heart stops beating. And the nurse finds them the next morning and they said, well, I don't know when they died, somewhere between, 2 and 4 a.m. They can't really narrow it down, but they do know that it did happen. And her point was, some of us have these dramatic testimonies where I went to church on Easter Sunday in 2020 on April 12th, and it was I streamed it online because we were in the middle of this big shutdown, and this preacher said this thing, and I was like, now's the time I gotta accept Jesus into my life. Or the same thing with entire sanctification. I felt God called me that I needed to give up all the things that I had been struggling with, and I just needed to stop messing around with that, and I need to be fully devoted to Him. Those are great testimonies. We all love those testimonies, but sometimes they're testimonies that aren't as flashy or dramatic, but are just as important, just as real, are the ones where um, it happened, but we can't remember when. And we all like being able to put, like, I was saved on this date, but sometimes we don't know. And I'll give you a great example. A kid in my youth group, I'll call him Tony. His name's not Tony, but when he came to our youth group, he didn't believe in God, and he made fun of us for believing in God, but he liked the games that we played, and he also liked hanging out with us because we wanted to be his friend. Over the next few months, as he came to event after event and Wednesday night after Wednesday night, finally one night we're on a youth group trip, and I felt like God asked me to ask him, uh, Tony, have you given your life to Jesus? And he said, no. And I said, Tony, don't you think it's time you gave your life to Jesus? This is a question that I don't often ask very much. It's not really my style, but when God tells me to do it, you do it. And he said, again, the question was, don't you think it's time that you ask Jesus in your life? And he said, I think I already did that. And I said, Tony, I'm confused. I asked you if you've already done it, and you said no. And then I asked you if you want to, and you said you already did. And he said, well, I never prayed a prayer that asked Jesus into my life, but I believe in God. And I was kind of thinking, well, believing in God and having a relationship with God are two different things. So I said, Tony, you believe in God, but do you love God? And he said, yes. And I said, Tony, do you know that you've done wrong things in your life? And he said, yes. And I said, Tony, have you ever asked God to forgive you for those wrong things? And he said, no. And he said, but I'm sorry for him, and I have told him that I'm sorry for it. Is that the same thing? And I said, well, yes. And then I said, Tony, have you ever asked Jesus to come into your life? And he said, again, no, but I think he lives in me. And I didn't really understand it until I remembered what Dr. Leclerc said. And Tony told me that over the past few months, he didn't believe in God, but as he sat there and listened, he began to believe in God, and he began to love God, and he began to feel guilty for the wrong things that he'd done in his life. And he began to want God to live in his life. And Tony can't point to a specific Wednesday or a specific event where he said, now's the day I'm going to accept Jesus. But he does believe in Jesus. And I know some of you would say, yeah, you should just lead him in a prayer. Lead him in a prayer. But here's the thing, that only makes those of us who want him to say a prayer feel better. If you were to ask Tony, do you believe in God? He would say yes. You ask him, are you sorry for the wrong you've done? He would say yes. And you would ask him, do you have a relationship with God? He would say yes. He's accomplished the goal. And I think it's not always about us trying to get people to do what we think they should do. It's about trying to get people into relationship with Jesus. And I knew that it was this gradual moment where somewhere along the line, Tony had killed his old flesh and he'd become a new creation. And that can happen for your salvation experience. That can happen for your entire sanctification experience. Ephesians 4 says this, as a prisoner for the Lord, then I urge you, live a life worthy of the calling that you've received. This calling to live an entirely sanctified life. I remember when I was in college, I was really struggling to understand what entire sanctification was. And I went to my wife's grandfather and I said, can you explain entire sanctification to me? And he gave me this great quote. His name's Ron Rhodes, and I want to share with you. He said, when we get saved, we get all of God. When we get entirely sanctified, God gets all of us. When you get saved, you get all of God. You can't get any more of God. God gives you to himself completely. He is in relationship with you 100%. There's no magic level where you unlock more of God in your life. Entire sanctification is that moment where you say, you know what, I want to give you what you gave me. I want to give you unrestricted access into my life. I want to give you a full commitment that I'm going to put you as the top priority of my life every day of the week. So I hope this has helped you. I would encourage you. There is a lot more to this, and I've tried to explain it like I'm explaining it to a kid, and I hope you've got a basic understanding of entire sanctification. I want to encourage you, find a manual of the Church of the Nazarene if you're in a Nazarene church. Get Article 10, it's in the front, look it up in the contents, and read it. It's several paragraphs, and it may be hard to understand, and if it is, ask your pastor. He would love to walk you through that. I would encourage you, whether you understand the paragraphs or not, go to the verses at the end, read the verses, and ask God, God, reveal your word to me. Help me understand this, and I want what you want for me. And I know that God will speak to you. Thanks for listening. Have a great day.